My son called me every Sunday morning at 7 a.m., always on time, never a minute late. The first question was always the same. Dad, did you take your medication? Then came, did you sleep well? Is anyone there with you? Sama order. Same calm, caring voice, for 18 straight months. I thought it was love. I was proud of it. Until the morning, an old friend stopped by, looked at the pill organizer on my bathroom counter, and went quiet for a moment before asking, Walter, what kind of pill is this? I picked it up and looked at it. Same white color, but a different shape, smaller, rounder, and it wasn't part of any prescription my doctor had ever given me. I stood there in my tiny bathroom, trying to come up with some reasonable explanation. Then a terrifying thought hit me harder than anything I had ever felt in my life. The only person who could have put that pill there was my son, the same son who visited on a perfect schedule every single week. My name is Walter. I'm 64 years old. I retired 3 years ago after 31 years with the Pittsburgh Water and Sewer Authority maintenance crew, then crew supervisor, then one of those middle management positions that sounds more important than it actually is. When my wife Margaret died of a stroke 2 years before my retirement, something in the shape of daily life shifted, not collapsed, shifted, the way a wall shifts after an earthquake still standing, but nothing is quite level anymore, and you learn to navigate by feel. I live alone in a 2-bedroom brick row house on a street where I know most neighbors by name. Margaret planted deep red roses along the back fence, bloomed every June like she'd scheduled them herself. I've kept them alive because it seems like the right thing to do. I don't require any more explanation than that. My son Derek is 38. He worked in software, something related to supply chain systems for logistics companies, which I never fully understood but always respected because he could explain it without making me feel stupid for not knowing it. After Margaret died, he changed, became more attentive, more present. I thought grief had done it to him the way it sometimes does, shook him awake, reminded him that the people he loved didn't have indefinite timelines. About 18 months before that Sunday in March, a pattern began. Every Sunday at 7 in the morning my phone would ring and Derek's name would be on the screen. I'd answer. He'd ask if I'd taken my blood pressure medication, how I'd slept. Then always third, whether anyone had stopped by or was there with me. I'd answer all three. We'd talk another 10 or 15 minutes. Football, the garden, whatever he was working on. Then he'd say he loved me. I'd say it back. And that would be Sunday. I told my neighbor Donna about those calls. She has 2 grown kids who might remember her birthday if the date appears on social media. She looked at me with something that bordered on envy. My old coworker Ray worked beside me for nearly 28 years on the city crew before he took early retirement and moved out to Greensburg, told me I'd raised that boy right. I believed both of them. I was proud. Then Ray came to visit. He'd had hip surgery back in November. This was the first weekend he felt well enough to make the drive. I told him to take the spare room. I'd make my mother's chili, the one Margaret always asked me to cook twice as much of, and then pretended she'd only had 1 bowl. Ray arrived Saturday afternoon, and we sat on the back porch until nearly midnight, talking the way 2 men talk when they've finally got enough time to be unhurried, slow, wandering, circling back through 30 years like walking a familiar trail without any particular destination. Sunday morning I was up at 6:30, coffee made. I was mentally sorting out how to tell Ray I needed a few minutes at 7, that Derek always called, that it was something I didn't like to miss. But Ray was still asleep and the house was quiet, and when my phone rang at exactly 7 and I saw Derek's name, something made me pause before answering. I don't know how to account for it precisely. It wasn't suspicion. I hadn't formed anything like that yet. It was more like a low-frequency awareness that the house felt different with another person in it, with Ray's eyes around. Like having a longtime friend present had reminded me of who I used to be before I'd become gradually, and without noticing, a man who gave a weekly accounting of himself to his child. I answered. Derek said good morning. His voice was warm, measured, the way it always was. He asked about the medication. I said yes. How'd you sleep? Fine. Then the third question. Is anyone there with you? I said no. I said it's just me. Quiet morning. A pause? 2 seconds, maybe less, then, good. Okay, good. The rest of the call was normal. Whether the roses were showing new growth yet. A podcast he'd started. He said he loved me. I said I loved him too. We hung up. I stood there with that cooling coffee, and a feeling I could not name. Not guilt exactly. Something stranger. Like I'd tested something I hadn't consciously meant to test, and the result had come back in a way I didn't know what to do with. Ray came down around 8. Eggs. Kitchen table. We'd been sitting there maybe 40 minutes when Ray set his fork down and looked at me with the expression I recognized from decades on job sites, the one he wore when something didn't add up and everyone else was walking straight past it. He said, "Walter, that pill organizer in your bathroom? Margaret had bought it for me years ago. 7 compartments, one for each day of the week. I'd kept using it because it worked. Ray said yesterday was Saturday. He said the Saturday slot was still full." Something cold moved through my chest. I told him maybe I'd missed a morning. It happened occasionally, but Ray was already shaking his head slightly. He said it wasn't my usual pill anyway. He knew what those looked like, white oval. This one was white too, but round, different size. I didn't say anything. I got up and went to the bathroom. He was right. I stood there looking at a small round white pill in the Saturday slot of an organizer I used every single morning without variation. I tried to build an explanation. A pharmacy error. Something that had rolled in from somewhere. But the organizer sat in the same spot on the same counter it always had. The only people who ever came into my house were me and Derek, on his visits every 2 or 3 weeks. Derek, who always used the bathroom when he arrived. Who always got water from the kitchen. Who sometimes went down the hall to check the thermostat, he said. I kept too low. I had thought all of that was sweet. I picked the pill up and held it in my palm. Ray stood in the doorway. Neither of us said what we were both thinking. That afternoon I called the pharmacy. The pharmacist on duty, a younger man who sounded patient and careful, listened while I described the pill. Shape, size, the faint scoreline down the middle. He put me on hold. When he came back, he said it was consistent with a diuretic, a water pill, taken alongside a blood pressure medication without proper oversight. He said carefully, a diuretic could cause significant blood pressure drops, dizziness, confusion, in older patients, and he chose his words with evident care. It could contribute to falls. It could, in certain circumstances, produce symptoms that resembled the early stages of cognitive decline. I sat down on the edge of my bed. I sat there for a long time. Ray found me. He sat down beside me the way he used to sit beside guys on the crew after a hard day. No ceremony, just present. Then quietly he asked what I wanted to do. What I wanted to do was find an explanation that wasn't the one forming in the back of my mind like something dark rising slowly toward the surface. I wanted to believe in a coincidence, a mix-up at the pharmacy, some innocuous thing with no shape. But I was thinking about the calls, the questions always in the same sequence, the third one always about whether anyone was there. And I was thinking about Derek's voice when I'd said no. The half-second where good wasn't warmth. It was the sound of confirmed variables. I thought about all the Sundays I'd told the truth. No, just me, nobody's been by. All the Sundays Derek had known exactly what he was working with. That Sunday he hadn't known. I had lied, and nothing had happened. Ray slept in the spare room that night. I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the kitchen going backward through 18 months of Sunday calls, looking for the moment something had shifted. And I found something, or thought I did. About 18 months earlier, right around when the calls became a weekly ritual, Derek had lost his job. He hadn't told me directly. I'd pieced it together from something he let slip about working from home. When I pressed, he acknowledged layoffs. He said he had savings, said he was fine. I believed him because I wanted to. Margaret and I had drawn up our wills years ago, shortly after she was diagnosed with hypertension. Mine hadn't been updated since she died. The row house bought in 1,998 inches, a neighborhood that had appreciated considerably, was worth significantly more now. Add the pension, the savings account we'd built over 3 decades together, and there was more there than I'd ever stopped to actually calculate. I had never thought of any of it as something someone might look at from the outside and see as an emergency exit, as a way out. I thought about it now, at 2 in the morning, alone in that kitchen. It felt different. Monday, I called Dr. Chen. She's my physician, direct, thorough, not given to alarm or to false reassurance. She asked me to come in that afternoon with every medication in the house. She ran blood work. She sent the round pill to a lab. The immediate results were not encouraging. My potassium levels were low. Not critically, but consistently in a way she said could account for the fatigue I'd been reporting for months. The heaviness in the mornings. The dizziness when I stood up too fast. I'd mentioned all of this at a checkup the previous fall. We'd attributed it to age, to the long adjustment of retirement. We'd agreed to keep an eye on it. She looked at me now and asked, very quietly, whether anyone else had been managing my medications or had access to them. I drove home and sat in my car in the driveway for 20 minutes before I could go inside. I want to be honest with you here, because I think this part matters. If Ray hadn't been there that weekend, not just to notice the pill, but to be a second person in the room when I had to start saying what I was beginning to understand out loud, I don't know what I would have done. There are things that stay abstract as long as you're alone with them. Ray made it real. He made it something I couldn't walk back into calling by a different name. Derek called on Tuesday, a midweek check-in, the kind he did occasionally. I answered from the kitchen table, looking out at Margaret's roses, and listened to him sound completely normal. He mentioned driving up Saturday for lunch if I was around. Come up, I told him. Noon works fine. After we hung up, I called Ray. He asked if I'd thought about going to the police. I told him I'd thought about almost nothing else for 3 days. But I also told him that the person I was thinking about reporting was my son, the only child Margaret and I had. The boy who, at 11 years old, had spent a whole weekend taking apart and reassembling a broken bird feeder in the garage, just to prove to himself he could fix it. The young man who had stood at his mother's grave in the November cold and held my hand without a word, because he understood that silence was the only thing that fit that moment. Ray said, I know, but that doesn't change what was in that organizer. He was right. He was completely right. But I needed to understand more before I acted. I needed to know how far it had gone, whether I was seeing clearly or building something terrible out of fragments that didn't fit together the way I was forcing them to fit. Saturday, Derek arrived at 11:40. Jacket half unzipped, slightly rushed, the same way he'd looked since he was a teenager who could never quite manage to be fully on time. He hugged me in the entryway and asked how I was feeling. Really good, I told him. Actually good. What he didn't know. I had removed the pill organizer from the bathroom 2 days earlier and replaced it with an identical one bought new, stocked entirely with my verified, correct medication. I had also, at Ray's suggestion, bought a small camera, the kind sold for watching pets when you're away from home. Ray had driven up Thursday to help me position it, angled through the partially open closet door toward the hallway. I want to be clear about how this felt. Setting up a camera in my own home made me feel ill. I am not a suspicious man by nature. My inclination, in almost every situation, is to extend benefit of the doubt for as long as possible, sometimes longer than is wise. But I understood, and this understanding cost me something I haven't finished accounting for, that my need to believe the best about Derek could not override what I had found in that organizer. We had lunch, sandwiches at the kitchen table. I watched my son's face across from me and tried to find the thing that would tell me I was wrong. He looked tired. He'd looked tired for a while now. A sustained tension around his eyes, the quality of someone carrying something they couldn't find a place to set down. He talked about the drive over, the weather turning, something he'd been listening to on his phone. He ate and drank his coffee and looked like nothing more or less than what he'd always seemed. A tired man in his late 30s trying to manage things he wasn't quite managing. After lunch, he asked to use the bathroom. Of course, I said. He was in there for almost 9 minutes. I sat at the kitchen table and counted each one of those minutes and hated every single one. I kept asking myself what I was hoping to find. What answer would be better? And the honest truth, the truth I couldn't talk myself out of, was that part of me was hoping for nothing. Hoping the camera would show me something completely ordinary. Hoping I would never have to do what I was prepared to do next. When he came out, something in his face was different. Not obviously, not guilty in a dramatic, readable way, just slightly less dense. The way a person looks when they've set down something they'd been carrying into the room. We watched part of a game. Around 3, he said he should get back before dark. I walked him to the door. He hugged me. He said he loved me. I said I loved him too. I meant it. Every word. That was the hardest part of everything that followed. Not the footage. Not the drive to the police station. Not anything in the weeks after that. The hardest part was saying I love you at that front door, and meaning every syllable while carrying what I was about to go find on that laptop. I watched his car disappear down the street. Then I locked the door and sat on the couch and didn't move for a long time. Ray was on the phone with me when I watched the footage. I had called him the moment Derek's car was out of sight because I didn't want to watch it alone. The camera was clear enough. Derek went into the bathroom and closed the door. About a minute in, the door opened a crack. Listening, I understood this later to confirm where I was in the house. The door closed again. He was in there for nearly 5 of those 9 minutes doing something the angle didn't directly capture, but that I no longer needed explained. I drove to the police station the next morning. I have thought many times about how to describe what it's like to report your own child to a stranger. There is no clean version of it. You sit across from a detective and you tell him about the organizer, the pills, the potassium levels, the footage, the Sunday calls, and what the third question sounded like when you told the truth versus when you told a lie. You watch him write things down, and underneath everything, you are still praying that he will find the thing you missed. The angle that resolves this into a misunderstanding. The detective, a quiet, methodical man in his 50s, took the footage, took photographs of the medications, told me the lab result was still pending and he'd follow up. Then he asked whether Derek had ever discussed finances, inheritance, the house. Yes, I said. After Margaret died, the practical conversations that death makes necessary. Derek knew what the house was worth. He knew about the pension. He knew because I had told him years ago that he was the primary beneficiary of everything. The detective asked when Derek had lost his job. 18 months ago, I said. He wrote something down. The next 10 days were a particular kind of waiting that I hadn't known before. I still made coffee, still went out to check on the roses, still picked up the phone on Sunday morning when it rang at 7. I answered Derek's questions in the same order I always had. I told him I'd taken my medication, slept fine, that it was just me, quiet morning. He said, good, okay, good. And I sat with that word in my chest like a stone I couldn't put down. The detective called on a Thursday afternoon, 11 days in. The lab had confirmed it. A diuretic, not prescribed to me, incompatible with my existing medication without physician supervision. The detective then relayed, in the careful, neutral register of someone conveying documented facts, what he'd found about Derek's finances. Savings nearly gone. Back rent on his apartment. A personal loan from 8 months earlier. Credit card balances growing since the layoffs. And then he paused the way people pause before the sentence that changes the shape of everything around it, and told me that 3 months ago, Derek had contacted an insurance agency to inquire about adding a life insurance policy for a parent. The process had never been completed, but the inquiry was documented. I thanked the detective. I put the phone down on the kitchen counter. I looked out the window above the sink at Margaret's roses. I thought about my wife. I thought about how she used to say that Derek had always carried more than he needed to, that even as a small boy, he had this need to manage outcomes to account for every variable before they could catch him unprepared. She said it with love, the way you name something in a child not to diminish them, but to see them honestly. I wondered whether she would have seen this coming. I thought probably, somewhere in the quiet back part of herself, she might have been afraid of it. 2 days later, Derek was brought in for questioning. I was not there. The detective advised me to stay home. I sat in the kitchen and I waited. What I learned in the weeks that followed came in pieces from the detective, from Derek's attorney, and eventually from Derek himself in conversations I wasn't certain I was ready for but chose to have anyway. Over the course of roughly 14 months, Derek had been intermittently substituting my blood pressure medication with a diuretic he had obtained without a prescription through an online source. Not on every visit. Irregularly. In a pattern that would be difficult to detect without targeted testing. The goal, as best as I now understand it, was not immediate. He was not trying to act quickly. He was trying methodically, slowly to create an accumulation of symptoms, fatigue, dizziness, forgetfulness. The kind of symptoms that, over enough time, might build until someone needed to step in, manage the finances, handle the accounts, oversee the house. Perhaps his attentive son, the one who called every Sunday, the one who had always been so good at checking in. When I first heard this laid out plainly, I could not connect it to anyone I had raised. The logic was so foreign to the man I knew that I kept looking for where the story broke down. But it didn't break. It had happened. What came next, what changed the shape of everything, was the psychiatric evaluation. At his attorney's recommendation, Derek underwent a full assessment. The psychologist's report described something I had not known how to name, had perhaps glimpsed in fragments but never fully recognized. A paranoid anxiety disorder with obsessive features, significantly worsened by the loss of his job. Over roughly 2 years, Derek had developed a set of fixed beliefs that people around me were positioning themselves to exploit me, to edge him out, to take what he'd decided it was his responsibility to protect. A neighbor, a friend. Eventually, a woman he believed I was romantically involved with, though I was not. The Sunday calls had started as genuine concern. Over time, without either of us recognizing the transition, they had become a weekly threat assessment. The psychologist noted something I have read and reread many times since. Derek did not believe he was doing anything wrong. In his understanding of events, he was protecting me. The fact that his method was slowly harming me had not registered within the framework of his thinking. The fear had grown so total that it had reorganized everything else around it, including, finally, love. I read that report 3 times, not because I'm thorough, because the first 2 times I was reading it hoping the words would rearrange into a different conclusion, hoping for the angle that made this a misunderstanding. The 3rd time I read it the way you read something that is simply true. My son was sick. He had been sick longer than either of us knew. The illness had grown in the dark in the space between Sunday calls and quiet weeks, in the distance between what he was experiencing inside and what he could find words to say out loud. If you have ever loved someone and then discovered that the person you thought you were living closest to had a room in them, you hadn't been allowed into a room where something had been building for years, without any windows, then you know the specific grief that doesn't have a clean name. It isn't anger, it's closer to vertigo, the feeling of the ground not being quite where you thought you were standing. Derek was not sent to prison. He entered a treatment program. He has been receiving medication and weekly therapy for several months now. We speak occasionally. The calls are short and careful, in a way that is nothing like the easy rhythm we had before. There is damage between us that I don't know how to calculate, and am not trying to rush. There are things I trusted that I cannot simply trust again. Not yet. I don't think honesty requires pretending otherwise. But I also know this. When Derek asked me every Sunday how I was sleeping, part of that question was real. When he stood at Margaret's grave in the November cold and held my hand without a word, that was entirely real. The illness didn't make him a stranger to me. It made him a person I hadn't fully seen, which is a different thing, and in some ways harder to hold. Ray drives up from Greensburg more often now. He was there the afternoon I cleaned out the bathroom cabinet and, for the first time since Margaret died, spent a real hour understanding what every pill I was taking was for what it did, what it was supposed to do, what it would be wrong to take alongside it. He sat at my kitchen table with a cup of my coffee and didn't make it sentimental. That's what 28 years of friendship looks like when you actually need it. It doesn't require decoration to work. Dr. Chen adjusted my medication after reviewing the blood work from the months of substitution. She said the effects were, in the long run, reversible. She said she was glad we'd caught it when we did. She used the word caught, the way you use a word when you know the alternative but are choosing not to say it out loud. Some nights, I sit on the back porch and think about how close it was. Not just physically, though, it was close that way, too. Closer than I like to dwell on, but close in the way of living beside something for a year and a half, and calling it by a different name. I called it love because that's what I was seeing, and what I wanted to see. A son who called every Sunday to ask how I was doing. That was real. It was just threaded through with something else. I couldn't see the way a rope can be fraying from the inside while it still holds your weight. There is something this story keeps teaching me that I didn't expect. It isn't be suspicious of the people who love you. It isn't some bleak lesson about how care can hide danger. The lesson is about attention, about the places where you've been paying selective attention, choosing the data points that confirm the story you've already decided you're living in. I had been doing that for 18 months. The fatigue I explained away. The dizziness I attributed to age. The half-second pause in a phone call that registered somewhere in me long before I had words for it. The morning I lied. Something quieter and more honest than my conscious mind took over. It gave the situation a different input to see what would happen. It heard the answer it got, and it started paying attention in a way I hadn't let myself before. I think a lot of people are living next to something they can feel but haven't named yet. Something sitting inside of routine, inside of care, inside of the small daily things that are supposed to be simple. The truest thing you can do when you notice it, that low-grade wrongness you can't quite articulate, is not to explain it away too fast. Give it room to become legible. Pay attention to what doesn't add up, not with paranoia, with honesty. And if there is one practical thing I want to leave you with, it's this. Know what is in your medication. Know what each one does, what it interacts with, what it shouldn't be combined with. Not because someone in your life is necessarily doing what Derek did, but because it's your body, and that knowledge belongs to you. If someone you love is managing your medication, and you couldn't describe what you take and why, have that conversation with your doctor today. This week, the question I'll leave you sitting with, is there somewhere in your life where you've been choosing the comfortable interpretation over the honest one, where something small has been adding up that you haven't let yourself total? Now I want to hear from you. Drop a 1 inch the comments if you think Walter made the right call going to the police. A 2 if you think he should have confronted Derek directly first. A 3 if you genuinely don't know, because that is the most honest answer and there's no shame in it. And tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there, because these stories reach people in places I never expected, and that matters to me more than I can explain. Have you ever lived beside something you could sense but couldn't name? Have you ever told a small, off-the-cuff lie and found out later that it protected you in ways you never intended? If stories like this one mean something to you, stories built around real human complexity, without easy villains or simple answers, then subscribe. I put out new videos every week, and every single one is built around the same principle, the truth of how people actually live, and what we do when we realize we've been seeing things wrong. Hit that button. It costs you nothing and it means everything. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania to create original content. Any resemblance to real people or events is coincidental.